You're 1,000 miles away, but
Hi everyone, this is Naomi Soko speaking, and this is a short video about connections, the chapter 5 from the book of Michael Dobbins, Urban Design and People. About the author. Michael Dobbins is a professor of the practice planning, formerly Commissioner of Planning and Community Development for the City of Atlanta. He participates in and contributes to a variety of planning, urban design, and transportation dialogues in organizations at the local, regional, and national levels. Connections, the infrastructure that ties people and places together. There are three interactive elements making up the content of urban design. First is the human activity, followed second by the physical world, and third are infrastructures that connect the first two elements. Together, they describe how the urbanizing world develops. Infrastructure is where coming together of forces that create the places where we share our lives is the most dynamic among the three. Over the past 150 years, the radical shifts of connections absolutely alter how people function and how physical world is being planned and built. In designing the present and future realm, the greatest changes are likely to occur in the problems, opportunities, and choices of infrastructure. The patterns of travelways directly impact the shape and character of built places. While travelways define the public space people commonly share, it also connects people to the more private buildings that house most people's living, working, and leisure activities. In similar importance but not so visibly defining the built world, connective strands such as electricity, energy, water supply and distribution, telephone lines and cable TVs, sewer and stormwater runoff systems are as vital as well. How all these systems and networks lay out is fundamental in shaping the built environment. Yet, architects, landscape architects, and city planners have not sufficiently incorporated infrastructure design into their baseline planning at the micro and macro levels. Their goal is to fulfill the purposes of each system, but to do it in ways focusing not so much on any particular piece. In spite of technology has aspired, its progression discussed in this chapter flow from problem-solving innovators, most with background in hard sciences and engineering fields. By defining problems too narrowly, however, occasionally wrong problems were solved. Now, what shall follow here is a more detailed but short descriptions of these infrastructural systems such as transportation, utilities, and communications. Transportation, how people get themselves and their stuff from here to there. Transportation is the dominant form giver to urban places and at the present times perhaps the most volatile in terms of what problems it faces and the choices available to meet those challenges. The most obvious among the various connective links are movement, travel, access, and mobility. While transportation remains the most prominent of the connective structures, walking is the base of all transportation. People must be able to get from where they live to where they make their livelihood. Mobility has progressed from walking to horseback, wagons, carriages, trains, biking, driving, and flying. No, not that flying. This one, I mean. The world has become successively more connected or smaller at each stage of transportation improvement. As with other human activity aimed at achieving improvement, in the case of trajectory of travel technology, organization and practice is uneven, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, but overall leaving people perhaps a little better off than before. Utilities. Utilities as networks defining urban form for the moment rest in a fairly stable state. Their generation and distribution means and methods are fairly straightforward and predictable, and their visual presence is more or less in place. While some urban designers like to point out that streets are more permanent than buildings, it is often the utilities under the streets that make changing street patterns difficult and expensive, not the streets themselves. Walk down any street and you see these utilities, though probably take them for granted. The ground below your feet is likely to be coursing with water, sewer, stormwater, gas, electrical, or fiber optic communication lines. The signs of these under the street travelways are everywhere. Manhole covers usually give you a clue to what's there and who owns it and where it is located, at least at that particular point. And of course, in most cities, there is likely to be a maze of overhead utilities lines, casting a web that seems the work of a drunken spider from poles that are often leaning and spaced awkwardly along the street, both with connections to buildings and structures. Of all these, each has its own implications for the design of places, regions, or both. And the last but not the least, the rival of transportation on the built world, communications. Right now, at least the advance of technologies of communication and society's response to these technologies pose fundamental challenges to how people communicate, organize their societies, generate, edit, and share information, all having wildly different and volatile scenarios for the future. The trend line, whether toward democratization or central control, will define the direction of society, with some societies characterized by one or the other leaning. In the built world, in the meantime, beyond these wildly diverging possibilities, communications show up in all our towns and cities in the form of overhead lines or buried lines. The lines themselves running the gamut from the copper that has dominated communication since the late 9th century to fiber optics, whose capacities are multiples higher than copper. Another insignificant intrusion in the urban viewshed is the cell tower. These towers, conceptually similar to most of the other separately engineered utility infrastructure, follow a logic that is based on spacing and topography that usually optimizes cost, profit, and communications efficiencies. It is important to keep in mind that the rapid rise in communications technology has coincided with a period. With all these, the biggest questions around whether people can make the world better or worse are more affected by infrastructure parameters and decisions than the other elements of the content of urban design. People, hopefully supported by the interdisciplinary synthesizing skills of urban designers, can have had, and must have a significant and decisive effect on the outcomes of these interactions. For these outcomes to improve life, the measure must value the whole of the people affected more than any particular segment.
Oh, my darling, dry your eyes. Daddy's coming